All right, welcome back to part two of Latin America, 1750 through 1900. We talked about the independence movements in Latin America, and we talked about why it took them a little while to get their act together because of class differences, concerns over racial groups. Remember, the Creoles are afraid of the Native Americans or the slaves ever getting their act together, particularly after there's a rebellion in Western South America, as well as the Haitian Revolution. But eventually they do. The Creoles get rid of the Spanish and the Portuguese, and they become independent. So what we're talking about now is what happens to them after they become independent. One of the places that was actually quite large when it gained its independence, a huge landmass wise, was Mexico. Um, Mexico stretched up into modern day California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. Really was probably over twice the size it is today as a nation. So, what shrank it? Well, United States. So there's the Northern Territory of Texas wanted independence, and after it gains independence, is annexed by the United States. The United States encouraged that independence movement because we wanted to expand. Why expand into Texas? At least partially, the economic motivation there was the rise of the importance of cotton and cotton plantations across the South into the Southern and the U.S. economy more broadly. Another big idea is manifest destiny. The United States wants to extend from coast to coast. We believe it is our God given right destiny, manifest destiny. It is our destiny to rule from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the whole outside of Canada and Mexico, the whole continental North America, continental North America. But Mexico, I just told you, had a lot of land there. So what about what are we going to do about that? Well, one of the things the United States does is it kind of picks a war with Mexico. It creates a conflict. So we have to go to war with Mexico. We're pretty darn successful in the war with Mexico. We win. We get half of Mexico's land. Now, it only takes a relatively small percentage of the population, but we grab about half of Mexico's land. Mexico loses a lot of economic potential, and there's a great mistrust of the United States by Latin America that starts pretty early. This is the 1840s. You remember we mentioned the Monroe Doctrine yesterday, 1823, which said no one will colonize our Western Hemisphere, North and South America, and we end up taking half of Mexico. Even General Grant, Ulysses Grant, hero of the Civil War, commented at the time that he thought it was a misplaced war, and it was an obvious example of a stronger nation imposing its will upon a weaker one. There also in Mexico is Benito Juarez, who is an intellectual who pushes for a secular nation. Now, what do you mean? What do I mean by secular nation? Secular means not having to do with non-religious stuff, having to do with things other than religion. So, what is he talking about? Well, what he's talking about, he's not talking about getting rid of the Catholic Church out of Mexico. No. Mexico, the Catholic Church is very strong, and he's not looking at that. What he is looking at is the idea that the government kind of distances itself from the church, a separation of church and state. So government is not run by the Catholic Church. You've got the church, you've got the government, and they don't mix. That goes back to one of the Enlightenment philosophers, a guy by the name of Voltaire. Voltaire said that if you take the church, combine it with the government, somebody's going to get persecuted. Somebody's going to get mistreated. Somebody's going to be thrown in jail. Somebody's beliefs they're going to be punished for. And so he said we ought to separate these two to provide individual freedom and rights for people. And Benito Juarez tries to bring that idea to Mexico, and he is somewhat successful. Here's kind of an expansion of the United States. The United States is often seen as an imperial power, and I think this map kind of shows it. Now, we don't think of ourselves as imperial. We think of places like England being an imperialistic, taking over parts of Africa, parts of India. Maybe Russia's imperialistic when it expands across Asia all the way to the Pacific. Well, the United States and Russia are on very similar paths during this time. We're both going to build transcontinental railroads. We're both going to expand to the Pacific Ocean. First off, we purchased the Louisiana Purchase. You guys will remember that's done by Thomas Jefferson. Excuse me. He buys it from Napoleon. Why does Napoleon have to sell so much land here in North America? Think about it a second. What's he busy doing in the early 1800s? That's right. He's trying to take over Europe, and he needs money. He does not have enough money. So he sells Louisiana to Jefferson. We've also got the territory to the eastern part of this map. You'll see territory of the 13 original states that had been disputed territory taken from Native Americans and the French. And then we get Texas. We'll get what you see: Nevada, Utah, Arizona, part of New Mexico, part of Colorado. We get from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. In fact, really pretty much everything inside that red line is that. So you see how much the United States expanded because of that war. What are some other examples other than Mexico? What about places like Argentina? Argentina follows a slightly different path. It is a republic. Like we said yesterday, everybody goes republic except Brazil, who goes monarchy. But everybody else goes republic, and it's a republic dominated by aristocrats. What allows their economy to expand, particularly during the second Industrial Revolution? Remember, that's the one in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Remember what distinguishes the second Industrial Revolution from the first Industrial Revolution is products. Products of the first Industrial Revolution are cloth, iron, steel, clothing. The second Industrial Revolution encounters or enables the telegraph, electricity, internal combustion engine, cars, airplanes, things like that. Argentina is known and still known for its beef, hides, and wool. And with money, this Argentina could implement reforms. Now, Buenos Aires, you see there on the map, is a very popular place for Europeans to move to. It reminds them a lot of Europe. And in fact, Buenos Aires will get the nickname the Paris of the Americas. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Why? What was the Brazilian transition to independence like? Actually, it was relatively smoothly. They kept slavery. They kept the aristocrats. They remained an export economy. They're still exporting sugar, but now they've added coffee. Coffee becomes a big export product for them in the 1800s. In fact, coffee really, beginning back in the 18th century, the 1700s, has become a very popular drink throughout the world, particularly in Europe. And plus, remember, it was Dom Pedro, who was the king's son, who leads the independence movement. So it's a pretty smooth transition. They break away, but it's still a relative of the king. It's everybody who's rich gets to stay rich, doesn't upset the social climate. So Brazil moves along pretty smoothly. What about cultural expression after independence? Well, initially, and what I mean is in the 1820s through about 1850, the first generation of independence in Latin America, they kind of stick with Europe. They very much copy Europe. They very much want to be like Europe, and kind of neoclassical traditions. Neo meaning new, classical meaning kind of modeling themselves off the Greeks and the Romans. The next generation turns to Romanticism. You remember we talked about that. That was a reaction against the Industrial Revolution. We talked about it back when we talked about Europe. And that is a reaction against what's going on in Europe, an appeal to emotion. Politicians also become less concerned about Europe and more concerned about the history of their own nations. They start to write a history of Argentina or Bolivia. By the way, for whom was Bolivia named? That's right, Simon Bolivar, who led independence movements. They start to write these histories with some industrialization in South America, not as much as in other parts of the world, but they are starting to industrialize. The new writers deal with corruption, prejudice, greed, and the old colonial structure of the Spanish and the Portuguese. Popular dance art, folk music differed very much from the elite. The elite very much want to be European. Everybody else is incorporating Native American culture, African culture, along with Spanish and Portuguese cultures. We're getting a real blending with what we're going to call syncretism, which is where you take different ideas and blend them together. I'm going to actually spend a whole 20-minute lecture on that one day. But syncretism, where you kind of pull everything together. We're going to talk about that. But despite the syncretism, despite some changes, the old patterns of gender, class, and race remain the same. How are women treated in Latin America? Although women were very active in the independence movements, fought hard, worked hard, they're pretty much ignored. Societies remain patriarchal. They've been very patriarchal. They'll stay patriarchal. And that's still a tradition in Latin America. There are many ways Latin American culture can be quite patriarchal. Women were seen under their father's control, then their husband's control. They're not supposed to work or enter contracts or control estates without their husband's permission. But let me say this, in reality, they do. So many of the poor women work because they have to. They may not be big business owners, but they're selling their food items and what they make on the street. That's still going on. They are more active, but they're not equal. But here comes the kicker. The women are involved in public education. Why? In these patriarchal societies, working with children is seen as women's work. But as I become a more sophisticated society, as I need bookkeepers, as I need bankers, as I need lawyers, I need to educate children. Now, I'm not saying the professors in the universities were women. No, those were men. But the lower grades are being taught by women because they're children. Women deal with children. But if I'm going to have women teach the children, what do I need to do with the women? Yep, I need to educate them. And once women become educated, start to read and learn that things don't have to be the way they are, who leads the feminist movements? That's right, these educated middle-class women, particularly teachers and the like. There is some compulsory education, but still only about 10% of women are literate, but they've become teachers, and that's going to be a whole new thing. Okay? So I've been hinting at it, there's the great boom of 1880 through 1920. This is part of the second industrial revolution. What happens is each country kind of focuses on an export crop or a couple of export crops. When things are good, they're making money. They're really making money. So when coffee's selling, coffee prices are good around the world, Brazil's raking it in. But there's a negative side to this economic pattern. If world market prices drop, they suffer. If the crop dies off because of a fungus infestation or just a bad weather or something like that, they drop. So these countries kind of go through boom and bursts and boom and bust, where they'll be doing pretty well and then not so well. There is rivalry, hostility between neighboring countries. We start to become involved, particularly at the end of this century. The U.S. Civil War did a couple things for the United States. And one of the things it really did is it kicked off industrialization, picked it up rapidly, particularly in the New England and northern states. So the U.S. is becoming a rapidly industrialized country. And as we do that, we become better armed, we have better ships, we need markets to sell our finished goods, and we're in the market for cheap food materials. So we start to do a lot of business with Latin America. One of the obvious examples is 1898, the Spanish-American War. The United States fights Spain. Now, we've been complaining for a while about Spain still controlled Cuba and still in parts of the Caribbean. We wanted them out. We go to war and over Cuba and Puerto Rico. The story goes that the Maine blows up in Cuban Harbor. The U.S. press gets really fired up and they want revenge for the Maine. They claim that the Spanish blew it up. Eventually, it doesn't look like that's what happened. It was a faulty boiler, blew up, but it gave an excuse to push for war. And with this, the United States involves itself directly, militarily in Latin America, and it won't stop then. We're going to do it a lot in the 1900s. We claim Guam, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba out of this war, but we don't keep Cuba very long. We grant Cuba its independence, sort of. We say to Cuba, you can run your own government, you can do what you want internally, but if you're going to trade or any foreign policy decisions have to be run through Washington. Okay, so we are very heavily involved in Cuba, although it's not a colony, and the Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines are colonies. We also become very interested in the Panama Canal. And you see Panama is circled right there on the map. And what we're looking for is a shortcut from the Atlantic to the Pacific. To go all the way down around the southern tip of South America, Cape Horn, is dangerous. There are storms. It's rocky. It's rough. It's long. We want to find a quicker way. The French originally had got a contract with Colombia, which controls Panama at the time, to try to dig a canal. They don't succeed. They fail. Malaria, weather, stuff like that prevents them from doing it. They don't quite have the engineering. U.S. becomes interested in Panama, but Colombia says, no, we tried that with the French. We're not granting anybody the rights. So what does the U.S. do? Well, the U.S. does something that when the Dutch and the British do it, we call it imperialism. What they do is they get involved in a local conflict. Panama would like to be independent of Colombia, so they rebel against Colombia. Who comes down to help them out militarily? United States. And then what do we say to Panama? Panama, as our payment, our reward for helping you in this independence war, we would like the Panama Canal. And so they give it to us for about 80 years. It splits their country in half, but it belongs to the United States. Latin America becomes weary of the United States. We've been involved in Cuba. We've been involved in Panama. That leads to a feeling of nationalism in Latin America, kind of a backlash. A common enemy frequently unites people, pulls them together. And the common enemy in this case is the United States. Catholicism tries to defend traditional views. And particularly in places like Argentina, one of the things we're going to see socialism make its way into this part of the world. There are a lot of socialists in Germany in the late 1800s, and so those Germans who moved to the Americas frequently bring socialist ideas with them. Okay, I'm near the end. So what are some global connections? Well, with this new Latin American nations in the world, what way did Latin America run counter to other 19th century trends? Well, if you remember back a chapter ago, we talked about imperialism. That was the idea where Europeans are going to Africa, going to India, going to China, and claiming land. In Latin America, the Europeans aren't claiming it, they're actually kicking them out. So we in North America and the Latin American countries kind of buck the trend that's going to go through this time period by kicking out the European colonizers. Okay. And it's hard to develop economies and governments when European expansion is always a threat. So that's why it really helps that the United States issues the Monroe Doctrine and in the late 1800s becomes strong enough to back it up. Latin America does kind of distance itself from the rest of the world. There'll be some involvement in World War I and World War II, but they don't really want to get involved in those because they're afraid of being recolonized. They just want to do business, try to get rich, but they don't want to be run by their countries. Okay. Mexico and Argentina are examples of economic transformation. The Native American population has been conquered, but they're going to start to re-involve the Native American populations right at the end of this time period and into the 1900s, into the 20th century. They're going to start to take pride in those Maya Aztec ruins. They're going to start to be proud of them. They're going to start to celebrate their Native American heritage. Also, technological innovation and economic prosperity allowed them to implement reforms. They start to involve more people in the vote. They start to expand the education for people. There are violent strikes by European-inspired migration. Then culmination of those strikes in 1910. Please remember that what they're doing is they are bringing in a lot of socialists, a lot of people are pushing for change in this part of the world. It's been oligarchies up to this point. You remember oligarchy is a word that means power by the few. O-L-I, having to do with the Greek word for few, and archy having to do with power. So it's power by the few. It's been aristocrats, but as businesses start to grow, as we start to see some industrialization, this new middle class is going to push back against these aristocrats, push back against the oligarchy for some political power of their own. And you'll see that throughout history. As classes gain economic power, economic wealth, they want political power as well. All right. So that takes us to the end. Please remember to turn in your notes. All you have to do is write it down on some of your own paper. Make sure that the pictures you take or the video you post is I'm able to read it, okay, and that you've got a little bit from each of the slides that covers through. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon. Thank you.